I am Hallie, 38 years old. At the Pentagon, I authorize national-level cyber strikes. But at my mother's dining table, I am just an unemployed daughter who needs to be taught a lesson. Colonel Miller, my mother's new boyfriend, just threw my $20,000 secure phone into the kitchen trash can because it vibrated during dinner. He jammed a finger slick with turkey grease into my face, the smell of alcohol reeking off his breath. In this house, I am the highest-ranking officer, and you freeloader, you are just a grunt. If you want dinner, you have to stand and serve me and my officers tonight. My mother just lowered her head, her hands trembling as she clawed at the tablecloth. He wants rank. Fine. He has no idea that in the trunk of my beat-up car is a set of dress whites with the silver star of a rear admiral. Tonight, he is going to get the most painful lesson in hierarchy of his life. If you have ever been lectured by someone inferior to you just because they are louder, leave a comment. Hit subscribe now, because this turnaround is for your silence. The air in the dining room was thick, suffocatingly hot, and smelled of stale grease and aggressive masculinity. We were 20 minutes into dinner, and Colonel Richard Miller, Army, retired, logistics, had not stopped talking about himself for 19 of them. You see, logistics is the backbone of the warfighter, Miller declaimed, swirling his glass. He was drinking Evan Williams, but holding the glass like it was Pappy Van Winkle. Back in Germany, in 1990, I managed a fleet of supply trucks that would make your head spin, Hallie. 500 units. Precision. Discipline. That's what's missing from your generation. I sliced into the pot roast on my plate. It was dry. Mom always overcooked the beef when she was nervous, and around Miller, she was perpetually terrified. I took a small bite, chewing mechanically. My face was a mask of polite disinterest, but inside my head, I wasn't in Norfolk. I was running a mental simulation of a polymorphic malware strain we'd detected pinging our servers from a basement in Eastern Europe 3 hours ago. I needed to be monitoring the containment protocols. I needed to know if the firewall held. Are you even listening to me, girl? Miller's voice boomed, snapping me back to the beige reality of the dining room. Yes, Richard, I said, keeping my voice flat. Germany, trucks, 1990, impressive. He narrowed his eyes, sensing the sarcasm but unable to prove it. He took a loud, wet slurp of his bourbon, the ice cubes clinking against his teeth. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, like nails on a chalkboard. You need to show more respect. You're 38, driving a rental car, wearing a hoodie to a Sunday dinner. No husband, no career, just drifting. Mom looked up, her eyes pleading. Please, Hallie. For me. I took a breath. I'm just figuring things out, Richard. That was when it happened. My pocket buzzed. It wasn't a text message. It was a rhythmic, haptic sequence. 2 long, 3 short. Red code, a level 1 breach attempt on the DoD network. My heart rate didn't spike. Training took over. My hand moved instinctively to my hoodie pocket. I needed to secure the device. I needed to authenticate the kill switch. But Miller was faster. His hand shot out across the table, his reflexes fueled by alcohol and rage. He snatched the black, heavy-duty encrypted device from my hand before I could unlock the biometric screen. I am talking, he roared. Give that back, I said, my voice dropping an octave. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind I used to silence a room of intelligence officers. Miller didn't like the tone. His face turned a mottled shade of crimson. You are addicted, he sneered, standing up and towering over the table. No discipline, no focus, just screens and toys. He turned and hurled the device across the room. Time seemed to slow down. I watched the $20,000 piece of classified hardware arc through the air. It didn't hit the floor. It landed with a wet, sickening thud right into the open kitchen trash can, which was currently filled with the remnants of tonight's cooking, congealed gravy, potato peelings, and the slimy red residue of canned cranberry sauce. Silence slammed into the room. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and my mother's sharp intake of breath. Richard, Mom whispered, her voice trembling. Quiet, Carol, Miller barked, not looking at her. He stared at me, his chest heaving, waiting for me to explode. He wanted a fight. He wanted me to scream so he could justify throwing me out. That is a lesson, Hallie. In the army, if a soldier couldn't follow basic instructions, we took away their privileges. You're a guest in my house, my rules. You have zero discipline. You are soft. You think the world owes you a living? I sat frozen. My mind raced through the implications. The device was waterproof, rated IP68, but it was sitting in organic waste. If the biometric sensor got obscured by grease, I would have to use the emergency override, which would trigger a location flag to the Pentagon. They would see the asset was stationary in a residential zone. I looked at Miller. I saw a small, insecure man puffed up on cheap liquor and past glories, trying to dominate two women because he felt irrelevant in the real world. Every fiber of my being wanted to stand up, sweep his legs, and pin him to the linoleum floor until the military police arrived. I wanted to tell him that while he was managing trucks in safe zone Germany, I was coordinating drone strikes in active combat theaters. But then, the voice of Marcus Aurelius floated through the red haze of my anger. The best revenge is to not be like your enemy. If I fought him now, I was just the angry stepdaughter. If I fought him now, Mom would suffer the backlash when I left. I slowly unclenched my fists under the table. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of pot roast and fear. I stood up. I didn't slam my chair. I moved with the precise, fluid grace of a predator who decides not to kill today. "Where do you think you're going?" Miller demanded, swaying slightly. I walked past him. I didn't look at his face. I walked straight to the tall stainless steel trash can. I looked down. The black device was half submerged in red cranberry goop. I reached in. The sensation was revolting. Cold, slimy sauce coating my fingers. I grabbed the phone and pulled it out. Sauce dripped onto the pristine kitchen tiles. Drip, drip, drip. I pulled the sleeve of my gray hoodie down over my hand and methodically wiped the screen clean. I checked the status light, still blinking. Good. I turned to face them. Mom was crying silently now, tears tracking through her foundation. Miller looked confused, his mouth slightly open, waiting for the tantrum that never came. I looked him dead in the eye. My expression was vacant, stripped of all emotion. "You're right, Colonel," I said softly, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Discipline is paramount." I turned on my heel and walked toward the back door leading to the garage. "I'm not done speaking to you," Miller shouted at my back. "I need to clean this off properly," I said, opening the door to the cold night air. "And I need to check the oil in my car. It's leaking." I stepped out into the dark garage and closed the door gently behind me, shutting out the sound of his voice. My hands weren't shaking. They were steady. I looked down at the phone. The screen flashed, awaiting biometric authentication. "Ghost actual to command," I whispered into the night air. "Situation unstable. Holding position." Miller thought he had won. He thought he had broken the rebellious teenager. He had no idea he had just declared war on a sovereign power. And I was about to bring the full force of the United States Navy down on his dinner party. The garage was freezing, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the dining room. It smelled of gasoline, old cardboard, and the faint, briny scent of the Elizabeth River that permeated everything in Norfolk. I sat in the driver's seat of my rental, a nondescript gray Ford Taurus, with the engine off and the doors locked. The interior dome light cast a harsh, yellow glow on my hands as I finished sanitizing the phone with an alcohol wipe I kept in the glove box. The cranberry sauce was stubborn, sticky in the charging port, but I finally got it clean. I pressed my thumb against the screen. The biometric sensor read my print and the device unlocked, flooding the small cabin with the blue light of the secure interface. "Ghost actual," I murmured, my voice steady. "Situation contained. False alarm. Hardware integrity confirmed. No extraction required." I waited for the acknowledgement from the automated system at the Pentagon. A single green checkmark appeared. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. If I had let that phone stay in the trash, or if Miller had damaged the containment seal, the GPS beacon would have gone active. Within 20 minutes, a black SUV carrying a tactical team from the nearby naval station would have kicked down my mother's front door to recover a classified asset. Miller would have been on the floor in zip ties, which would have been satisfying, but my cover would be blown. To the world and to my mother, I had to remain Hallie the failure, Hallie the drifter. Because Hallie the Rear Admiral, Director of Cyber Warfare Operations, was a ghost. My rank and my work made me a target for foreign intelligence. Anonymity was my armor, and right now, that armor was suffocating me. I shut the laptop, hid the phone under the spare tire in the trunk, and walked back into the house. The kitchen was empty. The trash cans still smelled of wasted food. I could hear the drone of the television from the living room, Miller watching reruns of old war movies, no doubt, and the soft sound of running water from the upstairs bathroom. I climbed the stairs to my old bedroom. It hadn't changed much since I left for the Naval Academy 20 years ago. The same faded blue wallpaper, the same scratch on the floor where I used to drag my desk. But now, it felt less like a sanctuary and more like a storage unit for Miller's ego. Stacked in the corner were boxes labeled Richard's Trophies and Field Gear. His presence was slowly pushing me out of the only space I had left. I sat on the edge of the twin bed, staring at my hands. A moment later, there was a tentative knock. Hallie. Mom pushed the door open. She had wiped off her makeup, revealing the deep lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes and mouth. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. She smelled of lavender hand lotion, the cheap kind from CVS that she had used since I was a kid. I brought you some towels, she said softly, placing them on the dresser. She didn't leave. She stood there, wringing her hands together. I'm sorry about dinner, honey. Richard, he's just passionate. He has high standards. He's a bully, Mom, I said, keeping my voice low. He threw my property in the garbage. That's not high standards. That's assault. Mom flinched. She sat down next to me on the bed, but she didn't touch me. She smoothed her skirt over her knees, staring at the floor. You have to understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's hard for a woman my age in Norfolk. All my friends, their husbands passed away or left. The silence in this house before Richard came along. It was deafening, Hallie. I would sit here at night and the only sound was the refrigerator humming. I felt like I was disappearing. I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the fear that governed her life, the generational terror of being a single woman in a society built for couples. He's a colonel, she added, as if the rank excused the abuse. He takes care of things. He's fixing the roof. He's managing the finances. He's a strong man, Hallie. I need a strong man. I can't do this alone. Please, just bear with him. For me? I'm not going to let him treat you like a servant, I said. It's just his way, she pleaded, tears welling up. He's under a lot of stress. Retirement is hard for men of his stature. She patted my hand, stood up, and left the room, closing the door softly. I sat there for a long time, the anger simmering in my gut. Men of his stature. I stood up and walked over to the dresser where Mom had put the towels. Next to the towels was a small stack of mail she must have brought up earlier and forgotten. My eyes scanned the envelopes. Past due, Dominion Energy. Final notice, Home Depot Credit Services, Virginia ABC Stores, Loyalty Rewards. I frowned. I picked up the Home Depot statement. It was addressed to Carol Campos, my mother. I opened it. The balance was staggering, $12,000 in charges over the last 3 months. Lumber, high-end power tools, a $3,000 outdoor grill. And then I picked up the bank statement. My mother's pension deposit from her 30 years as a school teacher hit the account on the 1st of the month. By the 3rd, it was almost gone. Cash withdrawals, liquor store purchases, consulting fees paid to an LLC I didn't recognize. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty window. Miller wasn't rich. He wasn't even comfortable. He was broke. He was using my mother's credit, my mother's pension, and my mother's house to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford. The colonel was financing his bourbon and his fake renovations on the back of a woman who was too afraid of being alone to check her own bank statements. He wasn't a patriarch. He was a parasite. He was gaslighting her into thinking she needed him while he was actively draining her life savings. I walked to the wall that separated my room from theirs. I could hear the muffled sounds of the TV turning off, followed by the heavy rhythmic snoring of Richard Miller. He was sleeping soundly, secure in his kingdom, believing he had successfully cowed the women in his life into submission. I looked down at the bank statement in my hand. My thumb traced the line showing a $400 withdrawal at a liquor store. "You picked the wrong house, Colonel," I whispered to the empty room. I thought about leaving. I could go back to DC, back to my clean, orderly apartment and my high-stakes war games. But if I left, he would bleed her dry. He would leave her with nothing but debt and a broken heart. I folded the statement and tucked it into my pocket. Mom asked me to stay to keep the peace. I would stay. But I wasn't going to keep the peace. I was going to bring a war. I lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the snoring through the wall. I wondered if my silence tonight had been a mistake. Had I enabled him? By not punching him in the face downstairs, had I given him permission to hurt her more? No, I told myself. Intel first, action second. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. I lay there, waiting. I synced my breathing to the rhythm of the house, preparing myself. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be the daughter. Tomorrow, I would be the inspector. And Richard Miller was about to fail his inspection. The digital clock on the nightstand flickered. 11:04 p.m. 6 hours until dawn. Through the wall, the snoring stopped for a moment, then resumed, louder and more arrogant than before. He was sleeping the sleep of the unjust. Enjoy it, Richard. It's the last good night's sleep you're going to get. At 05 hours, the world in Norfolk was still pitch black. The only light came from the orange glow of the street lamps reflecting off the morning dew on the lawn. I was deep in a dreamless sleep, the kind of exhaustion-induced coma that only comes after a day of emotional warfare. Then the sound tore through the silence. Tweet, tweet, tweet. A silver coaching whistle, the kind gym teachers use. It was piercing, shrill, and coming from 3 inches away from my ear. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs, adrenaline flooding my system before my eyes could even focus. Rise and shine, sunshine, Miller's voice boomed. He was standing in my doorway, fully dressed in a tracksuit that had been fashionable in 1998, the whistle dangling from a lanyard around his thick neck. Reveille sounded 2 minutes ago. In my unit, you'd be peeling potatoes for a week for this lethargy. I blinked, the red digital numbers on the clock burning into my retinas. 5:02 a.m. It was Sunday. Get up, he barked, clapping his hands together. We run a tight ship here. I need the parade boots prepped for the display case, and the crabgrass in the backyard isn't going to pull itself. Move, move, move. 10 minutes later, I was sitting on the cold concrete steps of the back porch, shivering in my hoodie. In front of me sat a tin of black kiwi shoe polish, a cup of water, a bag of cotton balls, and an old, cut-up white t-shirt. Next to them were Miller's parade boots, a pair of Corcorans that looked like they hadn't seen a layer of wax since the Clinton administration. Miller stood above me, leaning against the doorframe, sipping from a mug that said, Army Dade. The steam from his coffee curled into the cold air, smelling of hazelnut creamer and smug satisfaction. You know, he started, lecturing to the backyard at large. General Patton once said, a soldier without shiny shoes can't shoot straight. It's about attention to detail, Hallie, something you clearly lack. I didn't look up. I dipped a cotton ball into the water, squeezed it out until it was just damp, and tapped it lightly into the hard wax. Small circles, I told myself. Tiny, concentric circles. Patton never said that. Patton said, a soldier who won't save his money is a fool. But I didn't correct him. I just applied the polish to the leather toe cap. I fell into the rhythm. It was muscle memory from the Naval Academy. Plebe summer, Annapolis, 20 years ago. The heat, the screaming upperclassmen, The hours spent making black leather look like obsidian mirrors. My hands knew exactly what to do. Apply wax, work it in, friction, heat. Wait for the haze, buff, repeat. "You're using too much water," Miller criticized, hovering over my shoulder. "You're going to waterlog the leather. God, didn't they teach you anything in that community college you went to?" I wasn't using too much water. I was executing a perfect bull polish. I kept my head down, my jaw set so tight my teeth ached. The leather began to transform. The dull, scuffed black surface started to deepen, reflecting the porch light above us. "See?" Miller scoffed, slurping his coffee. "You're too slow. No urgency. In the real army, we did that in 5 minutes." He had been a logistics officer. He managed spreadsheets for truck tires. He probably hadn't shined a boot himself in 3 decades. I finished the left boot. It was flawless. A black mirror. You could count your eyelashes in the reflection on the toe cap. I started on the right one. By the time the sun began to bleed gray light over the fence line, both boots were done. My fingers were stained black, but the boots looked like they belonged in a museum. I stood up, my knees cracking from the cold concrete, and picked them up by the heels. "Done," I said shortly. "Bring them to my study," he ordered, turning his back on me. "Let's see if they pass inspection." I followed him into the house. His study was a small room off the living room that he had converted into a shrine to his own mediocrity. There were photos of him shaking hands with people who looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. But my eyes went straight to the shadow box on the wall behind his desk. It was a glass-encased display of his career, his rank insignia, his unit patches, and his rack of ribbons. I froze. The arrangement was wrong. It was subtle, something a civilian would never notice, but to an 07 Rear Admiral, it was like seeing a stop sign printed in purple. He had placed the National Defense Service Medal, the pizza-stained ribbon that everyone gets just for breathing during wartime, above the Army Commendation Medal. It was a violation of the order of precedence. You don't put a participation trophy above a merit award. It told me everything I needed to know. He didn't respect the uniform. He respected the costume. He was a man who played soldier, who cared more about how the ribbons looked color-coordinated than what they actually meant. "Well," Miller's voice snapped me back. He was sitting in his leather chair, pointing at the desk. "Put them down." I placed the boots on the blotter. They were perfect. The black leather gleamed, capturing the reflection of the ceiling fan above. Miller leaned forward. He squinted. He picked up the left boot and turned it over in his hands. He ran his thumb aggressively across the toe cap, leaving a greasy smudge on the mirror finish I had just spent an hour creating. He frowned. He couldn't find a scratch. He couldn't find a pit. He couldn't find a swirl mark. The silence stretched. His face grew redder. He hated it. He hated that I was competent. He hated that the failure had produced perfection. He stood up, holding the boot. He walked around the desk to where I stood. He looked me up and down, then looked at the boot again. Suddenly, he dropped the boot onto the carpeted floor. Not placed it, dropped it. Then, he took his slippered foot and nudged it, hard, knocking it over so the pristine toe cap scuffed against the wooden leg of the desk. "Sloppy," he sneered. "I can see swirl marks from here, and you missed the welt along the sole." "This is amateur hour, Hallie, typical. You do just enough to get by, never enough to excel." He sat back down and picked up his newspaper, dismissing me. "Take them back outside, strip them down, start over, and don't come back in until I can see my face in them." I looked at the boot lying on its side. I looked at the smudge his thumb had made. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that I had inspected sailors on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier who had more discipline in their pinky finger than he had in his entire body. I wanted to rip that shadow box off the wall and shove his order of precedence error down his throat. If you have ever had a boss, a parent, or a partner who purposely sabotaged your hard work just to make you feel small, I need you to hit that like button right now. Leave a comment saying, "I see you," so I know I'm not alone in this. I didn't scream. I didn't correct his ribbon rack. "Yes, Colonel," I said. My voice was devoid of life. I bent down, picked up the boots, and walked out of the room. I walked back to the kitchen, but I didn't go outside. I stopped by the back door. My hands were trembling, not from cold, but from the effort of not breaking his neck. I looked down at my own shoes, cheap, muddy running sneakers. Then I looked at the mirror-shined combat boots in my hand. He doesn't know, I thought. He doesn't know he's poking a tiger. Just then, my pocket vibrated. It wasn't the rhythmic red code buzz from last night. It was a standard text vibration. I set the boots down and pulled out my personal burner phone. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. Waffle House on East, Little Creek. 20 mics. Come alone. Bring an appetite. I stared at the screen. Only one person in Norfolk used the term mics for minutes and ate at Waffle House on a Sunday morning. I looked back at Miller's study door. He wanted me outside stripping wax? Fine, I'd be outside, just not in his backyard. I grabbed my keys. The colonel could wait. The tiger was hungry. The neon yellow sign of the Waffle House on East Little Creek Road buzzed with a low electric hum, a beacon of grease and sanctuary in the gray morning light of Norfolk. I parked the rental car between a lifted Ford F-150 and a muddy Jeep Wrangler, taking a moment to breathe. The air here didn't smell like Miller's cheap cologne or my mother's fear. It smelled of bacon grease, strong coffee, and exhaust fumes. It smelled like freedom. I pulled my hoodie down tight and walked inside. The diner was already at capacity. The sound was a chaotic symphony specific to the American South. The clatter of heavy ceramic plates hitting formica tables, the hiss of hash browns hitting the hot flat-top grill, and the waitress yelling orders in shorthand code to the cook line. Order up, all-star, scrambled soft, scattered, smothered, and covered. I scanned the room. In the far corner booth, facing the door, always facing the door, sat Grandpa Frank. At 80 years old, Frank looked like he was carved out of granite that had weathered a few storms. He wore a faded blue ball cap with gold lettering, USN retired. He was a former Master Chief Petty Officer, an E9. In the Navy, admirals might command the fleets, but Master Chiefs run them. He sat with perfect posture, nursing a black coffee, his eyes tracking every person who entered or exited the restaurant. I slid into the booth opposite him. The vinyl seat was cracked and taped over with silver duct tape, pinching my thigh. "You look like hell, kid," Frank said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He didn't smile, but the crinkles around his eyes deepened. That was his version of a hug. "Good morning to you too, Grandpa," I said, signaling the waitress for a coffee. Miller had me up at 500 polishing his boots. He quoted Patton, incorrectly. Frank snorted, shaking his head. Richard Miller wouldn't know George Patton from a hole in the ground. The man was a supply clerk. I checked his record. The waitress dropped a mug in front of me and poured steaming coffee without stopping her gum-chewing rhythm. "What can I get you, hun?" "All-star special," I said. "Waffle, eggs over easy, bacon, hash browns scattered." "You got it." We ate in a comfortable silence for a while. It was the silence of two people who didn't need to fill the air with noise just to prove they existed. I shoveled eggs into my mouth, realizing how hungry I was. The emotional labor of not snapping Miller's neck was burning more calories than a marathon. "Pass the syrup," Frank said, gesturing to the bottle near my elbow. I reached across the table. As I stretched my arm, the hem of my gray hoodie rode up just a few inches. It was a careless movement, one born of fatigue. I saw Frank's eyes drop. They didn't look at the syrup. They locked onto my right hip. Hidden inside the waistband of my jeans, tucked into a minimalist Kydex holster, was the matte black grip of my Sig Sauer P229. It wasn't a civilian carry piece. It was standard issue for naval intelligence and high-ranking officers in hazardous duty zones. I froze. I slowly lowered my arm and pulled the hoodie back down, but it was too late. The atmosphere in the booth shifted instantly. Frank set his fork down. The grandfatherly warmth evaporated, replaced by the sharp, analytical gaze of a man who had spent 30 years hunting submarines in the North Atlantic. "That's a P229, Frank said softly. His voice barely carried over the noise of the jukebox playing country music. Compact frame, no safety. That's not something you buy at a pawn shop, Hallie. I gripped my coffee mug. It's for protection, Grandpa. Single woman traveling alone. Don't lie to me, he cut in, his tone sharp. I know government issue when I see it. And I saw the way you scanned the room when you walked in. You didn't look for a table, you looked for threats. He leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a whisper. Your mother tells me you're unemployed. She says you're drifting. But drifters don't carry federal hardware and they don't have calluses on their trigger fingers. I looked at him. This was the man who taught me how to fish off the pier at Ocean View. The man who snuck me candy when Mom said no. He was the only male figure in my life who hadn't disappointed me. I decided to trust him. I leaned in, closing the distance between us over the sticky table. I'm not unemployed, Grandpa. I figured, he grunted. Intel? Cyber Warfare Command, I whispered. Frank raised an eyebrow. Officer? I nodded. Lieutenant, he guessed. Lieutenant Commander. I took a deep breath. I looked around to make sure no one was listening. The couple in the next booth was arguing about college tuition. The waitress was yelling about toast. We were safe. Oh, 7, I breathed. Frank froze. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He stared at me, his blue eyes widening. He processed the code. 07, Rear Admiral, lower half. In the rigid hierarchy of the United States Navy, a Master Chief, an E9, is a god to the enlisted men. But an 07 is a star in the sky. It meant I outranked every single person on the naval base down the road. It meant I outranked Miller by a margin so wide it was comical. Admiral, Frank whispered, the word feeling strange on his tongue. Yes, Master Chief, I smiled faintly. Slowly, a look of absolute, unadulterated pride washed over his weathered face. It started at his chin, which trembled slightly, and moved up to his eyes, which suddenly grew wet. He looked at me, not just as his granddaughter, but as a superior officer who had climbed the mountain he had spent his life guarding. He started to straighten up, his instinct to stand at attention kicking in. Don't, I hissed, putting my hand on his forearm. Sit down, Grandpa. Please, I'm deep undercover here. To Mom. To Miller. I have to be the failure. Frank relaxed, but his demeanor changed. He looked at me with a profound new respect. He sat taller. Oh, 7, he muttered to himself, shaking his head and chuckling. Holy hell! My granddaughter is a flag officer, and that idiot Miller, that pompous colonel, he has you scrubbing his floors. He thinks I'm undisciplined, I said, stabbing a piece of bacon. He's a fool, Frank spat. He's an 06 who never saw combat, barking orders at an admiral. If he knew, he'd have a stroke right here in the syrup. He can't know, I said seriously. Not yet. I need to get Mom out. I need to expose him for the fraud he is, but I can't blow my cover until I have the leverage to crush him completely. Frank nodded slowly. The old Master Chief was back, strategizing. He reached out and covered my hand with his own. His palm was rough, like sandpaper, but warm. You know your Bible, Hallie? He asked. Some of it. Proverbs 17:28, Frank quoted from memory, his voice steady and low. Even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. He squeezed my hand. You're doing the right thing, Admiral. Let him talk. Let him brag. Let him dig his hole. He picked up his coffee cup and toasted me. Give him enough rope, Hallie, Frank said, a mischievous glint in his eye. Give him enough rope, and that son of a bitch will hang himself before dessert is served. I smiled, genuinely, for the first time in 24 hours. Roger that, Master Chief. We finished our breakfast in a new kind of silence, a conspiracy of two. I wasn't alone anymore. I had backup. And as we walked out into the parking lot, I checked my phone. A text from Miller. Be home by 1400. I'm hosting a dinner party. You're helping. I showed the screen to Frank. He read it and laughed, a dry barking sound. There it is, Frank said, opening his car door. there's the rope. I pulled the Ford Taurus into the driveway at exactly 1400 hours. The house looked normal from the outside, a standard two-story brick colonial in the suburbs of Norfolk. But inside, I knew a storm was brewing. I stepped through the front door and was immediately hit by the chemical sting of lemon pledge. The house didn't smell like home, it smelled like desperation. My mother was on her hands and knees in the foyer, furiously scrubbing a scuff mark on the hardwood floor that I couldn't even see. "Missed a spot, Carol." Miller's voice drifted from the living room. "Presentation is everything. If the perimeter looks sloppy, the command looks sloppy." I walked in. Miller was standing in the center of the room, hands on his hips, surveying his domain. He was wearing khakis and a polo shirt tucked in so tight it looked painful. He looked like every micromanaging middle manager I'd ever fired, but with more hair gel. "You're late," he said, checking his watch. "I said 1400, it is 1402. "Traffic on I-64, I lied smoothly. "What's going on, Richard? Why is Mom scrubbing the floor like a recruit?" Miller puffed out his chest. "We are hosting dignitaries tonight, Hallie. Real officers. I ran into Major Henderson at the PX this morning. Good man, young, impressionable. I invited him and two of his captains over for dinner. They need mentorship. They need to hear from someone who has actually led men in the field." I suppressed the urge to laugh. He was inviting active duty officers over so he could hold them hostage with his boring, exaggerated war stories while feeding them my mother's cooking. It was an ego-feeding ritual, nothing more. "That sounds nice," I said neutrally. Miller narrowed his eyes. He walked over to me, invading my personal space. He smelled of aftershave and arrogance. "It's not just nice, Hallie. It is an opportunity. An opportunity for you to see what success looks like. Because looking at you..." He gestured vaguely at my hoodie and jeans. "It's clear you have no idea." "Here we go." "My friend Bob," Miller continued, his voice taking on that lecture tone I loathed. "His daughter, Brenda, she's your age. You know what she does? She's a nurse practitioner. She saves lives. She works 12-hour shifts. She bought her own house last year, a nice house, not a rental." He paused for effect, letting the comparison hang in the air like a foul odor. "And then there's you," he sneered. 38 years old, drifting, unemployed, living out of a suitcase. Do you know how embarrassing it is for me? When people ask what my stepdaughter does, what am I supposed to say? That she plays on her computer all day? My mother stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes were red. "Richard, please, Hallie is just taking a break. She's smart." "Smart?" Miller laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. "Smart people have careers, Carol. Smart people have ranks. Smart people don't wear hoodies to Sunday dinner." He turned back to me, his face hardening. "Which brings me to tonight. These men coming over, they are professionals. They are United States Army officers. I will not have you sitting at my table looking like a vagrant and bringing down the collective IQ of the room." I felt a cold calm settle over me. It was the same icy focus I felt before authorizing a strike package. "So, you want me to stay in my room?" "No." Miller smiled, and it was a smile devoid of warmth. "I need this dinner to run smoothly. Your mother is a terrible hostess when she's nervous, and she's always nervous. So, you're going to make yourself useful. For once." He pointed a thick finger at my chest. "You are not eating with us. You're going to serve." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Miller said, enjoying this. "I want you in black slacks and a white button-down shirt. If you don't have them, go buy them with whatever allowance your mother slips you. You will pour the wine. You will clear the plates. You will keep the water glasses full. And most importantly..." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a menacing hiss. "You will not speak. Especially not about military matters. I don't need you piping up with some ignorant comment you read on a blog and embarrassing me in front of my subordinates. You are the help tonight, Hallie. Do you understand? You are invisible." My mother let out a small, strangled sob. "Richard, you can't ask her to do that. She's your daughter. She's family." "She is a freeloader," Miller roared, spinning on her. And in this house, freeloaders work for their keep. If she wants a roof over her head tonight, she earns it. Unless she's too good for honest work. Is that it, Hallie? Are you too good to serve those who serve their country? I looked at him. I looked at the man who had drained my mother's pension, who had belittled her existence, and who was now trying to strip away the last shred of my dignity by turning me into a waitress in my own childhood home. He wanted a servant. He wanted someone in black and white to stand in the background and cater to his whims. A thought crystallized in my mind. It was sharp, dangerous, and perfect. Black and white. He wanted me in a white shirt and black trousers. He wanted a uniform. Well, I had a uniform. I looked at Miller. I didn't blink. I didn't cry. I let a slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across my face. "You're right, Colonel," I said softly. Miller looked surprised. He had expected a fight. He had expected tears. "I haven't been contributing enough," I continued, my voice steady. "You want me to serve? I'll serve. I'll make sure tonight is a dinner those officers will never forget." "Good," Miller grunted, though he looked slightly suspicious of my sudden compliance. "Black and white, hair back, no jewelry, and silence." "Understood," I said. "Silence is golden." I turned to my mother. "It's okay, Mom. Don't worry. I just need to run out for a bit. I need to go pick up my uniform." "Make it quick," Miller snapped, turning back to inspect a dust mote on the television stand. "They arrive at 1800. If you aren't standing at attention with a bottle of wine in your hand when the doorbell rings, don't bother coming back." "Oh, I'll be here," I promised. I walked out the front door, my car keys jingling in my hand. Miller thought he had broken me. He thought he had reduced me to the help. He thought he was the apex predator in this ecosystem because he shouted the loudest. He had absolutely no idea that he had just ordered a rear admiral to put on her dress whites. I got into my car and backed out of the driveway. I wasn't going to the mall to buy a waiter's outfit. I was going to the nearest Flying J truck stop to use the showers and change into the garment bag currently resting in my trunk. He wanted rank. I'd bring him rank. He wanted a uniform. I'd bring him the finest uniform in the United States Navy. He wanted silence. By the time I was done with him tonight, the silence in that dining room would be deafening. I merged onto the highway, the engine of the Ford Taurus humming beneath me. The ambush was set. The kill zone was defined. Colonel Richard Miller was expecting a servant. He was about to get a commander. I merged onto I-64 West, the engine of the Ford Taurus whining as I pushed it past the speed limit. My hands were loose on the steering wheel, my breathing rhythmic and slow. The anger that had been vibrating in my chest for the last 24 hours was gone. In its place was a cold, crystalline clarity. Miller wanted a show. He wanted a performance. I was going to give him the greatest show of his life. I tapped the voice command on the steering wheel. "Call Evans." The line rang once. "Lieutenant Commander Evans," a crisp voice answered. No pleasantries. Evans was my flag aide, a man I had handpicked from the Office of Naval Intelligence. He knew that when I called from the burner line, the world was usually burning. "Evans, this is actual," I said, my voice cutting through the road noise. "Status?" "Secure, Admiral. I'm currently at Naval Station Norfolk, reviewing the weekly readiness reports. Do we have a situation?" "We have a domestic hostile situation," I said. "I am activating the contingency plan. I need you to bring the official vehicle to the rendezvous point, the Walmart parking lot on Military Highway. ETA 15 minutes. There was a brief pause on the line. Evans was processing. "The black SUV, ma'am? The armored one?" "Affirmative. Full flag configuration. Clean it. I want the fender flags ready to mount." "Understood," Evans said, his tone shifting from administrative to operational. "Uniform for the event?" "Service dress whites," I said. "Choker collar, full medals, gloves." "Copy that, Admiral. Dress whites. I'll see you in 15. I hung up. I took the next exit, steering the rental car toward the Flying J Travel Center. It was a massive truck stop, a sprawling complex of diesel pumps and asphalt that smelled of exhaust and fast food. It wasn't glamorous, but it was anonymous, and right now, anonymity was the final stage of my chrysalis. I parked in the back, near the idling 18-wheelers. I popped the trunk. Inside lay the black garment bag that traveled with me everywhere. It was heavy, weighted down by the history and authority contained within. I grabbed it, along with my kit bag, and walked into the travel center. I paid $12 for a private shower suite. The attendant, a tired woman with frizzy hair, handed me a towel and a key code without looking up. I locked the door to the small, tiled room. It smelled of industrial bleach and cheap soap. I hung the garment bag on the hook behind the door and unzipped it. The sound of the zipper was loud in the small space. Zip! Inside, the white fabric gleamed under the fluorescent lights, the service dress white uniform. It was the most formal, most uncomfortable, and most commanding uniform in the United States Navy. I stripped off the gray hoodie. I threw it into the corner. That hoodie was Hallie the stepdaughter. That hoodie was the woman who cleaned toilets and got yelled at for eating too slowly. I took off the jeans. I took off the sneakers. I stood there for a moment, looking at myself in the mirror. I washed my face, scrubbing away the passive expression I had worn for 2 days. When I looked up, the eyes staring back were hard. They were the eyes of a woman who hunted state-sponsored hackers for a living. I stepped into the white trousers. They were tailored perfectly, a sharp crease running down the front that could cut glass. I pulled on the tunic. The high choker collar snapped shut around my neck, forcing my chin up, forcing my spine straight. You cannot slouch in dress whites. It is physically impossible. The uniform demands posture. Then came the hardware. I opened the velvet box, the shoulder boards, hard, black felt with gold lace, and in the center of each board, a single, silver star. Rear Admiral, lower half. I snapped them onto the shoulders of the tunic. Click, click. Next, the ribbon rack. 5 rows of colorful silk rectangles. The Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star with a V device for valor. Earned not behind a desk, but in a forward operating base in Kandahar when the mortar rounds started falling. I pinned the heavy rack to my chest, checking the alignment in the mirror. Perfectly centered, 1/4 inch above the left pocket. I put on the white gloves. I put on the combination cover, the white hat with the gold scrambled eggs on the visor. The transformation was complete. The woman in the mirror wasn't Carol's daughter anymore. She was a flag officer of the United States Navy. I opened my laptop on the small bench in the changing room. I tethered it to my phone's secure hotspot. One last step. For the last 48 hours, I had been operating under Ghost Protocol. My public files were scrubbed. If you Googled Hallie Campos, you found a few dead links and a fake LinkedIn profile for a logistics consultant. But tonight, Miller had invited active duty officers, young captains, a major. What is the first thing a young officer does when they are invited to a dinner party with a stranger? They do recon. They Google the guests. I logged into the DoD Personnel Command interface. My fingers flew across the keyboard. Subject: Campos, Hallie M. Current status, classified, ghost. I clicked the drop-down menu. Select new status, public queries, active duty. I hit enter. The screen refreshed. Status updated. Public profile, visible. Now, if anyone searched for me, the first result would be the official Navy biography. Rear Admiral Hallie Campos, Director of Cyber Warfare, Operations, the Pentagon. The trap was baited. The landmine was armed. I packed up the laptop and the civilian clothes. I picked up the garment bag, now light and empty. I walked out of the Flying J. Heads turned. Truckers stopped chewing their sandwiches. A family of tourists froze near the slushy machine. You don't see a rear admiral in full dress uniform walking out of a truck stop shower every day. I didn't make eye contact. I walked straight to my car, my heels clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. I got in and drove the short distance to the Walmart parking lot. In the far corner, idling like a predatory beast, was a black Chevrolet Suburban with tinted windows and U.S. government plates. Major Evans was standing by the driver's door, looking sharp in his service khakis. When he saw my rental car approach, he snapped to attention. I parked and got out. Evans's eyes widened slightly as he took in the dress whites, but he recovered instantly. He saluted. A crisp, perfect salute. "Admiral," he said. I returned the salute. "At ease, Evans." I tossed my civilian bag into the back of the SUV. "The car is prepped, ma'am," Evans said, opening the rear door for me. "And I have the fender flags in the glove box as requested." "Good," I said. "We have a dinner to attend." "And Evans?" "Yes, Admiral." "When we pull up, I want you to park directly on the lawn, right in front of the window." Evans smirked. "Understood. Aggressive parking maneuvers authorized." I climbed into the back seat of the armored SUV. The leather smelled of government polish and power. I checked my watch. 17:45. 15 minutes until showtime. I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. I thought about Miller's face when he threw my phone. I thought about my mother scrubbing the floor. If you have ever had to remind someone exactly who you are after they treated you like you were nothing, I need you to hit that like button right now. In the comments, type, "I am ready" if you are ready to see this bully get what he deserves. I settled back into the seat. "Let's roll, Evans," I said. "Target is acquired." The black SUV roared to life, and we rolled out onto Military Highway. The hunter was coming home. The dining room of the Miller residence was 80 degrees and smelled of overcooked beef and cheap cologne. It was 15 hours. At the head of the table sat Colonel Richard Miller, Reti, holding court like a feudal lord. He swirled his glass of bourbon, Evan Williams that he had poured into a crystal decanter to pass off as something top shelf, and gestured grandly with a lit cigar that he wasn't actually smoking, just using for effect. Across from him sat his captives, Major David Henderson and two young captains, standardized in their dress shirts and polite expressions. They were active duty Army, assigned to the nearby Joint Expeditionary Base. They were polite, professional, and currently enduring the special kind of hell reserved for junior officers forced to socialize with a senior retiree who thinks he's still in command. "You boys have it easy today," Miller boomed, his face flushed with the first two drinks. "Technology does all the work for you. Drones, satellites. Back in my day, in the lead up to Desert Storm, we didn't have iPads. We had maps, compasses, and grit." Major Henderson shifted slightly in his chair. On his lapel was a combat infantryman badge and a purple heart pin, subtle indicators that he had seen things in the Korangal Valley that Miller had only seen in movies. But Henderson just nodded respectfully. "Logistics is the art of war, gentlemen," Miller continued, oblivious to the boredom radiating from his guests. "I remember a night in Frankfurt. The convoys were stalled. Snowstorm. Command was panicking. I walked out there, no coat, just my sidearm, and I directed traffic for 6 hours. Saved the entire operation." One of the captains, a young woman named Rodriguez, glanced discreetly at her watch. Miller caught the movement. "Am I boring you, Captain?" Miller snapped, his joviality vanishing instantly. "No, sir," Rodriguez said quickly, her spine straightening. "Just checking the time, sir. We have an early briefing tomorrow." "Briefings can wait," Miller declared, refilling his own glass. "Wisdom cannot. You listen to those who paved the way." Just then, the swinging door to the kitchen pushed open. Carol Campos entered, carrying a heavy ceramic platter. She looked small and terrified. Her hands, usually steady, were trembling under the weight of the pot roast. The meat was gray and fibrous, surrounded by mushy carrots and potatoes that had been boiled into submission. The smell of burnt onions wafted off the plate. "Dinner is served," Carol whispered, placing the platter in the center of the table. Miller stared at the roast. He didn't pick up the carving knife. He looked at the meat, then he looked at Carol, and then he looked at the table setting. The silence stretched, agonizing and long. "Carol," Miller said, his voice deceptively soft. "Yes, Richard." "Where are the linens?" Carol froze. Her eyes darted to the empty spaces next to the forks. Oh my goodness, I left them in the dryer. I was just so worried about the gravy. Miller slammed his hand onto the table. The silverware jumped. The crystal decanter rattled. Unbelievable, Miller hissed, shaking his head as he looked at the officers. You see what I have to deal with? Simple instructions, napkins, forks, food. It's not nuclear physics, Carol. It is basic household management. Major Henderson looked down at his plate, his jaw tightening. Sir, it's really no problem. We don't need. I demand standards in my house, Major. Miller cut him off, pointing a finger at Carol. Go get the napkins, and try not to burn the house down on your way back. God, the women in this house are useless. Carol flinched as if she had been struck. She mumbled an apology and hurried back into the kitchen, wiping a tear from her cheek. The air in the room was now so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. The captains looked at their shoes. They were warriors, trained to fight insurgents, but they were helpless against a domestic bully protected by the rank of a retired colonel. Miller picked up the carving knife and sawed into the roast. It was dry. Flakes of meat crumbled off the bone. Dry, Miller muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Of course, like eating leather. He slapped a slice of meat onto Henderson's plate. So, Miller said, changing the subject as if he hadn't just verbally assaulted his partner. You asked about the stepdaughter earlier, Hallie. Henderson cleared his throat, grateful for the pivot. Yes, sir. You mentioned she's staying with you? Miller laughed. It was a wet, hacking sound. Staying? She's leeching. That's what she's doing. He took a large gulp of bourbon. 38 years old, Miller said, leaning in as if sharing a conspiracy. Unmarried, no kids, no career. She drives a rental car and wears clothes that look like she pulled them out of a dumpster. A complete failure to launch. That's unfortunate, Henderson said neutrally. Unfortunate? It's embarrassing, Miller spat. I tried to instill some discipline in her. I had her up at 500 today polishing my boots. You should have seen her. Pathetic. No attention to detail. I bet she's never worked a hard day in her life. He stabbed a potato with his fork. I told her she couldn't eat with us tonight, Miller announced proudly. I told her if she wants to stay under my roof, she needs to earn her keep. So, I'm having her serve dinner. Waitress duty. The female captain, Rodriguez, looked up, her eyes widening. Sir? You're making your stepdaughter serve us? Ideally, yes. Miller smirked. She's late, of course. Typical. Probably crying in her car somewhere because I raised my voice. But when she gets here, don't hold back, gentlemen. If your water glass is empty, snap your fingers. If you drop your fork, make her pick it up. She needs to learn humility. She needs to understand that in the real world, there are leaders and there are servants. And she is a servant. Miller leaned back, satisfied with his monologue. He felt powerful. He felt in control. He had his audience, he had his whiskey, and he had his punching bags. Both his wife and her disappointing daughter. She thinks she's special, Miller muttered, swirling the ice in his glass. She walks around with this attitude, like she knows something I don't. Well, tonight, I'm going to break that attitude. I'm going to show her exactly where she stands in the food chain. Major Henderson opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to politely excuse himself from this nightmare. But he was interrupted. Ding dong. The doorbell chimed. It was a crisp, clear sound that cut through the humid tension of the room. Miller checked his watch. 18:05. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. Speak of the devil, Miller said, pushing his chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The maid has arrived. He stood up, adjusting his belt. He looked at the officers with a wink. Excuse me, gentlemen. I need to go welcome her. And by welcome, I mean I'm going to tear a strip off her for being 5 minutes late. You might want to cover your ears. I'm going to use my command voice. Miller strode out of the dining room, marching toward the front door with the confidence of a man walking to his coronation. He was ready to shout. He was ready to belittle. He was ready to crush the spirit of the woman standing on his porch. He reached the front door and grabbed the handle. He yanked it open, his mouth already forming the first word of his insult. You. but the word died in his throat. Because the person standing on the porch wasn't wearing a hoodie. And they certainly weren't a servant. The heavy oak door swung open with violent force. Colonel Richard Miller stood in the doorway, his face a mask of performative outrage, his mouth already open to deliver the blistering lecture he had rehearsed in his head. "You are an absolute disgrace." The word died in his throat. It didn't taper off. It was severed, cut short as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. Miller blinked. He blinked again. His brain, sodden with cheap bourbon and arrogance, tried to process the image in front of him, but the data didn't match the file. He was expecting a 38-year-old failure in a stained gray hoodie. He was expecting slumped shoulders and averted eyes. Instead, he was looking at a wall of blinding, pristine white. Standing on the porch, bathed in the sharp glow of the halogen security light, was Hallie. But it wasn't his Hallie. She stood 6 inches taller than usual, her spine steel straight. She was wearing the United States Navy service dress white uniform. The high choker collar was fastened tight around her neck, forcing her chin up in a posture of regal defiance. The fabric was immaculate, tailored to a terrifying precision that no costume shop could replicate. On her head sat the white combination cover, the black visor gleaming. And on that visor, Miller's eyes darted to the gold oak leaf embroidery. Scrambled eggs. That wasn't for junior officers. That was for senior command. His eyes dropped to her shoulders. Hard black shoulder boards, gold lace, and in the center of each board, catching the light like a supernova, sat a single silver star. Rear Admiral. Miller took a stumbling step back, his hand slipping off the doorknob. What is... he stammered, his voice trembling. Behind Hallie, parked aggressively on the front lawn with 2 wheels crushing his beloved azaleas, was a massive black Chevrolet Suburban. The engine was idling with a low, predatory rumble. The windows were tinted impenetrable black, and on the front bumper, a flagstaff holder displayed a blue flag with a white star. Lieutenant Commander Evans stood by the rear door of the SUV. He was in his service khakis, looking sharp enough to cut skin. He saw Miller staring, and he didn't smile. He snapped a crisp salute to Hallie's back, then assumed the position of parade rest, watching Miller with the cold, bored expression of a man who guards nuclear secrets for a living. "You're late, Colonel," Hallie said. Her voice was unrecognizable. It wasn't the soft mumble of the stepdaughter. It was the projected, resonant command of a flag officer. She stepped forward. Miller instinctively retreated into the foyer, his legs feeling like jelly. He couldn't understand it. It had to be a joke, a prank. But the medals... His eyes locked onto her ribbon rack. 5 rows. The Defense Superior Service Medal. The Legion of Merit. Ribbons that took a career to earn. They were perfectly aligned, exactly 1/4 inch above her left pocket. Hallie crossed the threshold. The sound of her Corfam shoes on the hardwood floor was sharp and rhythmic. Click, click, click. She walked past Miller as if he were a piece of furniture. She didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead, toward the dining room where the guests were waiting. Miller turned, mouth agape, watching this stranger invade his home. In the dining room, Major Henderson was facing the entryway. He had a forkful of dry pot roast halfway to his mouth. He looked up when he heard the heavy footsteps. Through the archway, he saw the white uniform. He saw the shoulder boards. He saw the star. Major Henderson didn't think. He didn't process. His training, 15 years of Army discipline ingrained into his bone marrow, took over instantly. The muscle memory of a soldier overrides everything, even confusion. The fork clattered onto his plate with a loud clang. Henderson shot out of his chair like he had been electrocuted. His chair tipped over backward, crashing loudly onto the floor, but he didn't flinch. He stood ramrod straight, chest out, chin in, eyes locked forward. "Room! Attention!" Henderson bellowed. His voice was a thunderclap that shook the crystal in the cabinet. The 2 young captains, who had been sipping their water, scrambled. They didn't ask questions. If a major yells, "Attention," you stand up. Chairs scraped violently against the wood as they leaped to their feet, snapping their bodies into the rigid position of attention, arms pinned to their sides, thumbs along the seams of their trousers, eyes fixed on a point on the wall. Even Carol, terrified and confused, stood up, clutching her napkin to her chest. The room froze. The silence was absolute. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic clicking of Hallie's heels as she walked into the dining room. She stopped at the head of the table. She stood there for a moment, letting the image burn into their retinas. She was a monolith of white and gold. The room felt smaller with her in it. The air felt thinner. Miller stumbled into the room behind her, looking like a disheveled waiter who had lost his tray. He looked at Henderson standing at attention. He looked at the captains who were sweating, terrified that they were out of uniform in the presence of a flag officer. "Major," Hallie said softly. She didn't yell. She didn't have to. "Admiral," Henderson barked, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. "Ma'am." "At ease, gentlemen," Hallie said. The three officers relaxed slightly into parade rest, feet shoulder-width apart, hands behind their backs. But they didn't sit. You never sit until the Admiral sits. Hallie slowly began to peel off her white gloves. She pulled the left one off, finger by finger, the fabric sliding against her skin with a soft whisper. Then, the right. She slapped the gloves into her left palm and placed them neatly on the table, right next to the bowl of mushy carrots. She turned her head slowly to look at Miller. He was standing by the sideboard, his face a pale shade of gray. He looked at the star on her shoulder, then at his own reflection in the mirror. A retired colonel in a tight polo shirt, sweating, smelling of cheap whiskey. The contrast was brutal. The hero and the failure had switched places, and the reality was crushing him. "Hallie," Miller croaked, his voice cracking. I didn't." "Admiral Campos," Hallie corrected him. Her tone was sub-zero. "And you are currently in violation of Article 133 of the UCMJ, Colonel. Conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman." Miller flinched. "You invited these officers here for a lesson in leadership," Hallie continued, walking slowly around the table. She ran a finger along the edge of the dining chair, the one she wasn't allowed to sit in. "You told them I was a servant. You told them I was a failure. You told them I needed to be taught humility." She stopped in front of Major Henderson. "Major, has Colonel Miller been instructing you on his logistics triumphs in Germany?" "Yes, Admiral," Henderson said, staring straight ahead. "Did he mention that his command was a supply depot that failed 3 consecutive inspections in 1991? Henderson's eyes flickered. "No, ma'am." Hallie turned back to Miller. He was shrinking. He was physically shrinking against the wall. The legend he had built, the brave colonel, the war hero, the patriarch, was dissolving like sugar in hot water. "I apologize for being late," Hallie said, addressing the room but keeping her eyes locked on Miller. "Colonel Miller told me he needed someone to serve dinner. He wanted black and white. He wanted silence." She stepped closer to Miller. He smelled of fear now. "I decided to wear my own black and white," she whispered, gesturing to her uniform. "And as for silence, I think you've done enough talking, Richard." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the Home Depot credit card statement she had taken from her mother's room. She dropped it onto the table next to her gloves. "This dinner is over," Hallie declared. "Major Henderson, you and your officers are dismissed. You have my gratitude for your patience with this charade." "Thank you, Admiral," Henderson shouted. "Let's go, captains." The 3 officers grabbed their covers and practically ran out the front door, desperate to escape the blast radius. The front door slammed shut. Now it was just Hallie, her mother, and the man who had called her a failure. Hallie looked at Miller, who was trembling, clutching the back of a chair for support. The arrogant bully was gone. In his place was a sad, broken old man who had just realized that the servant he tried to crush was the one holding the hammer. Hallie turned to her mother. "Pack a bag, Mom," she said gently. "We're leaving. And we're taking the Admiral's car." The front door clicked shut, sealing the 3 of us inside a silence that felt heavy enough to crush bone. The sound of the officers' cars peeling out of the driveway faded into the distance, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the shallow, ragged breathing of Richard Miller. He was leaning against the sideboard, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the mahogany wood. The color had drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, pasty gray. He looked less like a colonel and more like a cornered animal, realizing the cage door had just locked. "Hallie," Miller started, his voice trembling. He tried to force a smile, but it came out as a grimace. "Hallie, honey. Listen. It was a joke. A test. You know, the military method, breaking you down to build you up." I didn't blink. I simply took one step forward. The sound of my heels striking the floor echoed like a gunshot. "Admiral Campos," I corrected him. My voice was low, devoid of any warmth. "And you are currently standing before a superior officer while intoxicated, Colonel. In the active fleet, I would have you tossed in the brig for Article 133 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman. Do not insult my intelligence by calling this a test." Miller flinched. The reference to the UCMJ hit him harder than a physical blow. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped up in his past rank, having the military legal code weaponized against him was his ultimate nightmare. I didn't know," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "Your mother? She never said." "My mother didn't know because I protect my assets," I said, walking slowly toward the dining table. "Unlike you." I picked up the folded piece of paper I had dropped on the table moments ago. It was the Home Depot credit card statement, stapled to the bank records I had printed from my secure laptop in the car. "You talk a lot about discipline, Richard," I said, unfolding the paper. "You talk about logistics, about management. But looking at these numbers, the only thing you've successfully managed is to embezzle $40,000 from a retired school teacher." My mother, who had been standing frozen near the kitchen door, let out a sharp gasp. "What?" I turned to her. "Mom, come here. Look at this." "Hallie, don't." Miller lunged forward, desperation in his eyes. "That's private. That's household business." I didn't even look at him. I just raised my hand, palm out, fingers flat, in a universal gesture to halt. The command authority radiating off me was so intense that Miller stopped dead in his tracks, panting. I handed the papers to my mother. "Look at the dates, Mom," I said gently. "The roof repairs that cost $5,000, there was no contractor. The money was withdrawn in cash at a casino in Atlantic City. The consulting fees for his LLC, they go straight into a private account that pays for his liquor and his cigar club membership." Mom's hands shook violently as she held the statement. She squinted at the lines, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. "Home Depot. $3,000, she whispered, reading the line item. "Richard, you said that was for the lumber to fix the porch." Miller licked his lips, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an exit that didn't exist. It was an investment, Carol. Tools, high-grade equipment. I'm building equity in the house." "You bought a big green egg grill and a patio set," I cut in ruthlessly. "I saw them in the shed. They're still in the boxes. You didn't buy them to fix the house. You bought them because you have a shopping addiction and you're using my mother's pension to fund it." I stepped closer to him, invading his personal space. I towered over him in my heels and cover. "You aren't a provider, Colonel," I hissed. "You're a parasite. You found a lonely woman with a steady state pension and a paid-off mortgage, and you moved in to bleed her dry while treating her like a servant in her own home." Miller slumped. The fight went out of him. He looked at the floor, defeated. The great patriarch, the war hero, the disciplinarian. It was all smoke and mirrors. He was just a sad, broke old man with a drinking problem. I can fix it," Miller mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I'll pay it back. I just need time." "You don't have time," I said. "And you don't have a place here anymore." I turned back to my mother. She was staring at Miller, but the fear was gone from her eyes. It had been replaced by a profound, heartbreaking pity. She looked at the man she thought was her protector and saw him for what he really was, a liability. "Mom, I said, softening my tone. My driver is outside. We are going to the Marriott downtown. I've already booked a suite. We're going to order room service. You're going to take a long bath. And tomorrow morning, my legal team will be here to serve him with an eviction notice and a forensic audit demand. Carol looked at me. She looked at the white uniform, the stars, the strength. Then she looked back at Miller, who was leaning against the wall, looking old and small. He's got nowhere to go, Hallie, Mom whispered. That is a logistical problem, I said coldly. And since he's the logistics expert, I'm sure he'll figure it out. Mom took a deep breath. She looked down at herself. She was still wearing the floral apron she had put on to cook the pot roast. The roast Miller had insulted. The roast she had slaved over. Slowly, deliberately, she reached behind her back and untied the knot. The sound of the fabric sliding against her dress was the only sound in the room. She pulled the apron over her head. She folded it once, neatly, out of habit. Then, she let it drop. It hit the floor with a soft whump. It lay there between them, a flag of surrender that had turned into a declaration of independence. "Goodbye, Richard," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. It was steady. "Carol, wait!" Miller stepped forward, reaching for her hand. "You can't just leave. Who's going to take care of the house?" She looked at him with a sad smile. "I suspect you'll have plenty of time to figure that out before the eviction notice kicks in." She turned to me. "I'm ready, Admiral." I offered her my arm. She took it. We walked toward the front door. My heels clicked on the hardwood. Her sensible shoes shuffled softly beside me. We didn't look back. I opened the heavy front door. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of freedom and the exhaust of the waiting SUV. Major Evans was standing by the open rear door of the Suburban, his posture perfect. "Evening, ma'am," Evans said to my mother, snapping a salute that was just as crisp as the one he gave me. "Welcome aboard." Mom smiled, a genuine shy smile. She climbed into the leather back seat of the armored vehicle. I paused at the threshold. I turned back one last time. Colonel Richard Miller was standing in the middle of the dining room, surrounded by half-eaten food and empty chairs. The crystal decanter of cheap bourbon sat on the table, mocking him. He looked small. He looked obsolete. He looked like a man who had been given enough rope and had done exactly what Grandpa Frank said he would do. "Clean up the kitchen, Richard," I said. "I hate coming back to a mess." I closed the door. The latch clicked shut with a finality that echoed through the house. I walked down the steps, the silver star on my shoulder catching the moonlight, and got into the car. "Let's go, Evans," I said. Mission accomplished. The black SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving the house, and the man inside it, disappearing into the darkness of the rearview mirror. In the military, news travels faster than a supersonic jet. We call it scuttlebutt. And the story of what happened in the dining room of Colonel Richard Miller spread through the base like wildfire. By the next morning, the tale of the pompous retired colonel who tried to make a rear admiral serve him pot roast had become legend at the officers' club. The 3 junior officers who had fled the scene didn't keep quiet. Why would they? They had witnessed a masterclass in karma. Miller became a pariah. The consulting contracts he had been fishing for evaporated overnight. No one wanted to do business with a man who was currently under investigation for financial impropriety and who had humiliated himself so thoroughly in front of active duty command. I heard through Evans that Miller ended up accepting a full permanent retirement to avoid a deeper probe into his finances. He was left alone in that big, echoing house in Norfolk. The last I heard, the lawn was overgrown, the parade boots were gathering dust, and the only company he had was his bottle of Evan Williams. He had wanted to be the king of his castle, and now he was the sole inhabitant of his own ruin. But I didn't spend much time thinking about Richard Miller. I was too busy watching my mother come back to life. 6 months later, the spring sun was shining over Alexandria, Virginia. I stood on the back patio of the small, charming townhouse I had helped Mom rent. It was only 10 miles from the Pentagon, close enough that I could stop by for dinner, but far enough that she had her own independence. Mom was down in the garden, wearing a sun hat and gardening gloves, pruning a massive bush of blue hydrangeas. She wasn't wearing an apron. She wasn't looking over her shoulder, terrified that she was doing it wrong. She was humming a song by James Taylor, her hands moving with a confidence I hadn't seen in 20 years. She looked up and saw me watching. She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Hallie," she called out, waving a trowel. "The soil here is amazing. Look at these blooms." I walked down the steps. "They look great, Mom." She stood up and wiped her forehead. "You know, for years, Richard told me I had a black thumb. He said I killed everything I touched. He wouldn't let me plant anything in the front yard because he said it would ruin the property value." She looked at the vibrant blue flowers, shaking her head. "I realized something, honey," she said softly. "It wasn't me. It was the environment. You can't bloom when someone is constantly blocking your sun." I hugged her. She smelled of earth and expensive sunscreen, the kind she never used to buy for herself because Miller said it was wasteful. "I'm proud of you, Mom," I whispered. "I'm proud of me too," she said, squeezing my hand. "I joined the local garden club yesterday, and I met a nice man named Arthur. He's a retired librarian. He doesn't yell. He just likes to talk about books." I laughed. A librarian sounds perfect. She was safe. She was happy. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that being alone is infinitely better than being with someone who makes you feel lonely. But today wasn't just about the garden. Today was the day. 2 hours later, we were at the Washington Navy Yard. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of the Potomac River and the brassy sound of the Navy band playing Ruffles and Flourishes. The white chairs were set up in perfect rows on the manicured grass. Flags snapped in the wind, the stars and stripes, the Navy flag, and my personal flag. It was the change of command ceremony. I stood on the raised platform, wearing my service dress whites. My sword hung at my side. Across from me stood the outgoing Vice Admiral, ready to relinquish authority. But my eyes weren't on the brass. They were scanning the front row. There, sitting next to my mother, was Grandpa Frank. He had refused to wear a suit. "Civvies don't cut it for this, Hallie," he had told me. He was wearing his old dress blue uniform. It was a little tight around the middle, and the fabric was worn, but his gold chevrons and service stripes were polished to a shine. He sat with the rigid posture of a Master Chief Petty Officer, his white hat resting on his knee. As the orders were read, "Rear Admiral Hallie Campos, United States Navy, assumes command." I looked at him. Tears were streaming down his weathered cheeks. He didn't wipe them away. He just nodded at me, a slow, solemn nod of acknowledgement. The E9 saluting the O7. The grandfather saluting the granddaughter who had listened to his advice. Give him enough rope. I had given Miller the rope, and now I was standing here, holding the weight of the fleet on my shoulders. I stepped up to the podium. The microphone hummed. I looked out at the sea of white and khaki uniforms, hundreds of sailors and officers awaiting my orders. I took a breath. I thought about the speech I had written. It was full of strategic goals and cyber warfare doctrine. But in that moment, looking at my mom's radiant face and Grandpa Frank's tears, I decided to go off script for the opening. "Distinguished guests, shipmates, family," I began, my voice echoing across the yard. Abraham Lincoln once said, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I have learned recently that power is not about who has the loudest voice in the room," I continued. "It is not about who can belittle others to make themselves feel big. It is not about demanding respect while giving none." I thought of Miller, alone in his empty house. True power is the discipline to remain silent when a fool is speaking. True power is the quiet confidence of competence. And above all, true power is the ability to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I looked directly at my mother in the front row. "We serve," I said, my voice strengthening. not to be served, but to ensure that freedom and dignity are preserved for everyone, whether that is on the digital battlefield or at our own dining room tables. I snapped the folder shut. "I am ready to relieve you, sir," I said to the outgoing admiral. "I stand relieved," he replied, saluting. "I assume command." The boatswain's pipe whistled, a high, piercing sound that signaled the transfer of authority. The band struck up "Anchors Aweigh." As the music swelled and the applause broke out, I looked up at the blue sky above the nation's capital. I felt a profound sense of peace. The anger was gone. The need for validation was gone. I didn't need Miller to know I was a success. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. I was Hallie Campos. I was a daughter. I was a granddaughter. And I was the admiral. And as I walked down the aisle, passing Grandpa Frank, he leaned in and whispered one last thing, loud enough for only me to hear. "You look sharp, Admiral. No swirl marks on those shoes." I smiled. "No swirl marks, Master Chief. Just a perfect reflection." The sun was shining. My mother was laughing. And the silence in my heart was no longer heavy. It was the silence of a calm sea after a long, hard storm. My war with Colonel Miller is finally over. But I know many of you are fighting your own battles right now. Maybe it's a boss who steals your credit, a relative who talks down to you, or someone who mistakes your silence for weakness. Remember, silence isn't surrender. It's just reloading. If my story gave you the strength to stand a little taller today, please hit that subscribe button and join our ranks. We share stories of justice here every day. And tell me in the comments, what is your silver star moment? I want to hear how you won your war. This is Admiral Campos, signing off.